Okay, sounds good. So I'll call the meeting to order at 6:05. Um, I will do roll call next. Let's see here.
You want me to do that for you? I have my
sure,
list. Okay,
if you want to, yeah.
good. Melissa Daly.
Here.
Robert Bonner's not here yet. Gabriel.
Present.
Dominic is excused. Leslie.
Here.
Irma is supposed to be here. She's not yet. Robert Moxley is not here yet. And the mayor is excused. So we're good to go from there.
Okay, I think we would approve minutes next, but do we need a quorum to do that?
We need to do a quorum, so we don't have one yet. So we'll delay that until later. So that will provide the opportunity for Steve to jump into public outreach.
Great. Robert Bonner is online, but not visible. He said he can hear us.
Okay.
So note that in the record. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Here we are. Citizen Advisory Committee meeting number 3 for the Newburgh Middle Housing Project. Thanks, as always, for volunteering your time to help us with this project. Let's go to the next slide. So if you recall from our first 2 meetings, we were essentially reviewing the requirements of House Bill 2001, introducing you to different middle housing types, and talking about discussing concepts for how middle housing might be integrated into the City of Newburgh's code. We recently had a public meeting. I think maybe a few of you were there and probably helped us generate some questions during our the Q&A period of that meeting, and thanks for those who attended. We also administered an online survey since that time. So we're going to start out tonight with reporting on the findings from that online survey, and then Elizabeth will walk us through our proposed code updates related to duplexes, and then some related to design standards for other middle housing types. At meeting number 4, which I believe will be scheduled for February 17th, we're going to go into more of the code updates for the other middle housing. So tonight, again, we're mostly focused on duplex related code, though getting into some of the other middle housing types in relation to design standards. And then at our next meeting, we'll be walking through the other middle housing types. We'll have some discussion and then wrap up with next steps. Next slide. Online survey results. So kudos go to Doug and his team at the city. We had 192 responses to our survey, which I think is a pretty good response rate for a topic like housing, which doesn't always have people coming out of the woodwork. The survey was open for about a month, from December 15th to January 11th. And we asked a series of questions, which I'll go through the results in just a moment here. And most of those questions, we asked about different concepts and asked people how they rate them on a scale from 1 to 4, because you're going to see some scores coming up. So just remember, the lower score, closer to 1, people felt something was not important. The closer it is to 4, the more important or very important people think it is. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we started by asking what some of the top policy goals should be for introducing middle housing zoning standards. And before I go through results, I will say there's no, I'm going through these results now just for you to keep in mind when we get to Elizabeth's presentation and portion of the meeting. I think it's important to keep in mind how the community responded to these questions. So these don't necessarily tell us we have to do one thing or don't have to do another, but it's more, let's keep these community preferences in mind as we move forward with our recommendations. So in terms of top policy goals, the items that were towards the top of our list here, parking, making sure that we're managing parking impacts within neighborhoods. Probably not a surprise to any of you that that would be very important to people. Also very important to people is making housing more affordable, which is, of course, one of the main reasons why we are engaged in this effort. Other responses that are deemed, pretty important: creating more opportunities for home ownership, ensuring middle housing is compatible with existing development, and making it easier and safer to get around by walking. Less important, people feel less important, are things like creating more rental opportunities, making regulations more flexible, and increasing the number of housing units that can be built. And as we go forward from question to question, I think you'll see, obviously the same people answered all these questions. You're going to see some similar responses for some of our more detailed questions. Let's go to the next slide, please, Elizabeth. All right. So question number 2 was, knowing that standards must be applied equally to duplexes and single-family detached dwellings, how important are the following duplex code standards? And at the top of our list, we're adding a requirement for a garage or carport. Again, the automobile/parking issue rising to the top of people's consciousness. And allowing attached and detached configurations. So there was some desire to allow some flexibility in these configurations. Third, you see limiting the overall size of buildings as somewhere in the somewhat to important range for people. On the bottom end of our scale, modifying setbacks and lot coverage standards to allow for more units. So changing standards and regulations to allow more units, and then reducing minimum lot sizes to allow for more duplexes. So, a little bit of conflicting in that we're, hearing the desire for more affordable housing, but, not for changing standards to allow more units on parcels potentially. And again, we'll see these themes going forward. Next slide, please. Number 3, how important are the following triplex and quadplex code standards? Again, at the top, addressing the location of parking areas relative to the street and dwellings. So where are parking areas relative to the street and relative to dwellings? And allowing, less important, that's significantly important at almost 3.5. Less important, allowing detached and attached configurations and limiting the overall size of buildings. And then again, towards the bottom, the least important, modifying setbacks and lot coverage standards to allow for more units. We're seeing some themes emerge. Townhouse code standards. Again, far and away the most important item code standard is addressing the location of parking areas relative to the street and dwellings. Also, here's a new one that we had for townhouses, regulating the minimum and maximum number of units in a single building. And again, limiting the overall size of buildings. Way down at the bottom again, modifying setbacks and lot coverage standards to allow for more units. Let's go to the next one, Elizabeth. Cottage cluster code standards. Again, with a score of 3.5, providing options for shared parking or parking close to each cottage. So where is that parking located relative to the units? And then down towards the bottom again, modifying setbacks and lot coverage standards to allow for more units. Somewhere in the middle, things like orienting cottages around a shared courtyard, limiting the overall size of buildings, creating physical and visual connections between dwellings and the street. I think that's the last one. So, I would just say before Elizabeth starts, in summary, we always are dealing with tensions and in how people feel about these issues. And so just again, while we see that there are many people who are, for whom providing more affordable housing options is important, they're also very concerned about how that's done. and particularly how is parking accommodated for these newly allowed units, and being thoughtful about how many units are allowed or what changes are made to the code to allow for more units. Heather, Elizabeth, you looked at these results as well. Is there anything else that jumped out at you in terms of themes that I might have missed?
I think you nailed it as far as parking being the thing we heard the most about. And then in the comments also, which, were numerous, parking came up more than anything else. But I think you definitely, from my perspective, gave the gist for sure.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, we used the survey tool as an educational tool as much as anything. And so what you don't see in these results is all the background information that we shared about each of these housing types. And so even beyond the specific answers that we got, what we were really hoping came out of this survey, and why we're glad 192 people took the time to go through it, is that they're that much more familiar with what middle housing is and what we need to do. And so in terms of that education, we tried to emphasize where there are state requirements that need to be met, but you can see, in those overall policy priorities, even though say, creating more units or creating more rental opportunities didn't necessarily rank high among respondents, that doesn't mean that we're going to ignore the HNA findings or other needs that have already been identified in the community. So, it's another piece that helps inform where we go.
Thanks for that reminder, Elizabeth. I think that's important to note. Does anyone have any particular questions about the online survey results? Again, I think they're just important to inform our discussion going forward here as we listen to Elizabeth's presentation and discuss code update proposals. So with that, I will hand it to you, Elizabeth.
I actually have one question. So I kind of skimmed through some of the questions and the written answers, and I wonder what your perception is, because you said that there was educational materials on there, and I'm just wondering, in reading the questions, I did still have, I wasn't sure if everybody really understood still. I mean, this is complicated stuff. And so some of the comments were saying, I don't want developments like this. And I'm like, well, this isn't all developments, like this is middle housing and, filling in a little bit. It's not massive. So I don't know. I mean, what's your sense in reading it through more thoroughly that people had a good understanding of what this is?
I think it's a mix. I mean, there's people, to Elizabeth's point as well, who clearly did not understand that this is something the city has to do by state ordinance, mandate, and it's not just something the city's choosing to do. And it's always going to be a mix. So, of those 192 people who responded, hopefully some of them, read the materials and understand what we're trying to accomplish. But I'm certainly not under the illusion that everyone 100% understands the details. I would hope that we've also, in addition to education, created some awareness. I would hope that we would see a better turnout at our next public meeting, so we can answer more of people's questions directly at that time. That would be my hope. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my attempt.
Yeah, no, that's good. I was wondering if more people would be at this meeting, but it doesn't look like it.
Yeah, I would think people will hopefully turn out, and we'll work on advertising that next public meeting, and there will be another online survey for them to share their opinions that way as well. But it would be great to see more people face to face and be able to directly answer those questions. Sometimes hearing a response from someone directly is a lot easier than reading it on a screen or on a piece of paper. So that's my hope, that more than anything, we created some more awareness about this project and what the city's doing.
Yeah, and we did also ask people if they were comfortable to share their email addresses. So that's, we can contact those people directly to tell them about the next open house and perhaps help get them there.
And this
And-
is, and Elizabeth, part of the response to Melissa's question is, I regularly get that, well, behind my house is a vacant field. It's always going to be a vacant field. And I have to graciously remind people that, well, your house was on a vacant field as well. And the people next to that one thought that that vacant field was always going to stay a vacant field. And so I try to help educate people to understand that, we have all these zoning we have our comprehensive plan, our zoning designations, and this land is all planned out to be developed over time. Doesn't mean it will happen tomorrow, but it will happen over time. And so what we're dealing with now is the situation with HB 2001 is it's saying that in low density residential, you can now have duplexes. And Elizabeth will get into the details of all of this. We've talked about it at several meetings already, because we have these specific plan areas and areas that are not in specific plans. But it doesn't mean that every unit that's going to be developed is going to be a duplex. If we go back to looking at that, 1%, max 3% is going to occur, is when you look at that in the overall context of what will be developed and what's already on the ground and will be developed, it's a very small percentage, and it's market driven. The developers are going to make that determination if they're going to build those types of units or not. And the consultant team and I have had conversations about just, the appearance. I mean, yes, we do have some limitations of what we can do on the design stuff, but that building envelope for a duplex can look very much like a single family home. But what we've consistently heard from the committee, and I think through the survey, based upon the comments that Steve provided, is parking is an issue. Parking is an issue. And so you as a committee will have to, consider that and address it as you develop eventually a recommendation that will go on to the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Yeah, and I guess just the last piece I would add, building on that, Doug, is that the survey was not designed to sway public opinion, shall we say. If people came to it and they were against the concept, then it's an if they want to take the opportunity to learn more, great. If they want to take the opportunity to leave their comments about how much they hate this, that is also their option. So, and where we get as a result of that, we want to take the feedback that can help guide the direction of the code. And just acknowledge the full range of feelings that's out there. That's my motto for 2021. We're just acknowledging the feelings. So with that, let's talk about some of the ways that we have developed this duplex code, as we actually transition from that code audit and some concepts into the specifics of what this looks like and how we use some of those, more constructive public comments and what we've heard from the group. So let's see, in your packets, you've got the full strikeouts and underlines and, full code chapters to show you where all the changes are. I certainly know that can seem overwhelming, particularly, without the understanding of exactly which chapter affects which other chapter. But that's the magic of zoning code. And what we tried to do was summarize it in the cover memo. And we wanted to highlight for you here some of the, big picture, what all those strikeouts and underlines and highlights, when you put it all together, what it is accomplishing. So the first part is we settled on the term duplex dwelling and included a new definition that allows for those attached and detached configurations, and then use that consistently through the code. Then the key part, right? This is what HB 2001 is all about, is we're allowing duplexes with the same requirements as single family detached dwellings on all the same lots in the R1, R2, R3, RP, and AR zones, right? So R1 is the lowest density, R2 is, increasing density, R3 is the, third most dense out of 4. RP is the residential professional that I believe is near the hospital. Maybe? Nod? No? Quasi nod from Doug?
It's it's scattered kind of throughout town.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Good point. And the AR, this is just a kind of a weird fluke. It's the airport residential zone. It doesn't affect very many lots, but we double checked with DLCD and we do have to include it. So what we're trying to do in those zones is make sure that duplexes are permitted on the same size lots as single family detached dwellings. And so we kept the existing minimum lot sizes for single family dwellings, and we just applied those to duplexes as well. And that's a change from the current code where there's both a minimum lot size and a minimum lot area per dwelling. Which effectively means you need twice as large a lot for a duplex as a single family detached. So we took that part away. So same lot, you can build either way. And then, you know, as much as we heard from the community about parking, we did revise the parking requirement to meet the statutory requirements of 1 off-street parking space per dwelling unit. So that's 2 off-street spaces for a duplex. We did not explore, you know, opportunities to further reduce that. The model code brings it down to even 0 off-street parking spaces. There's opportunity for on-street parking credits. And with everything we heard about parking, we didn't see the appetite or the support to do anything more than changing it to 1 per dwelling unit. So that is the proposal. And then just to talk a little bit more about those lot sizes. So one thing that, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about internally and with Doug is how do we reconcile these concepts about density and lot sizes? And density, of course, is something, you know, that comes up all the time when you're talking about housing is how dense is it? How much housing? You know, the idea that more dense is just more units packed in together. And, you know, for some people that seems less livable. Right, and sometimes fuels those concerns, particularly in lower density areas like R1, where people feel like, oh, these new middle housing types could just really increase the density of the area and change the neighborhood character. So there's both that piece as well as a technical piece about the way that the city of Newburgh addresses density. So what we have come to understand is that the comprehensive plan, then implemented by the zoning code, sets a density target of how many dwelling units will be per gross acre. And so by using the gross acre, it's more of a generalized definition and accounts for, you know, any of the land that is in a natural resource area like a stream corridor, or anything that can't be built on. It also accounts for roads or parks or other public uses. So, you know, just if we start in that R1 zone, the target is 4.4 units per gross acre. Now, the minimum lot size that's allowed in that zone had already, you know, is currently 5,000 square feet. And so our job with this project is to also allow duplexes on 5,000 square feet. So in some ways you could say, well, holy moly, I can do the math here. And the lot sizes really don't match the density targets. And so what are we, especially once you start allowing duplexes on those lots? And so how are we going to reconcile this? And so there's 2 things that are important to understand here. One is the minimum lot size is the controlling regulation that will affect duplexes. And so that is the number that we need to align in the code to meet HB 2001. And the density targets are just that, they're targets. And so what the city is hoping to do is that overall, the whole mix of housing, you know, both in these zones is headed towards that target. And I might not have my notes handy. So if you have questions, Doug can refresh your memories about the actual historic densities that the city has observed in these zones and how they match up with the targets. But if you remember that discussion about how much middle housing we're expecting, you know, we're expecting 1%, maybe 3% of new housing to be duplexes. So even if we did see that, you know, we're not going to overshoot the density target by so much if only a narrow, you know, a small percentage of the new development is built at this higher density. And so the recommendation is to, again, just focus on the minimum lot sizes in the code, and that the city can continue to track the density targets and the actual densities built. And if needed, in 5 to 10 years, the city might go back to those density targets in the comprehensive plan and have a community discussion about whether those should be adjusted.
Yeah, so Elizabeth, you got a good point. So in our housing needs analysis, it identifies that our net density for R1 is historically 4.8. Historically in R2, it's 7.9. And in R3, it's 18.7. So we've been close to meeting the targets. And so I had a conversation with the consultant team about this. So back in 2010, in our low density, we were, prior to 2010, we were only at about 3.4 dwelling units per acre. So we weren't even coming close to meeting our target densities. And same thing was happening in our R2. And so that's where they lowered the lot sizes. So R1 went from 7,500 square feet to 5,000. And R2 went from 5,000 to 3,000. So what we saw over the course of the last 10 years is by doing that, is we were getting closer to our net density. And it gets complicated, as Elizabeth said. We got, gross density and net density, but we're getting closer to our density targets. And so one of the things that the state is looking at, and it even comes out of House Bill 2001 in the master plan areas, is 8 dwelling units per acre. And so right now we're trending a little under 8 dwelling units per acre. And a large part that is because we don't have a lot of R3 land and to accommodate that multifamily. And so under this context, it would be 5 units and above, because we're breaking it down now to deal with the duplex, triplexes, and the quads. And so this is a recalibration. 10 years later, we're doing yet another recalibration to be more efficient with the land supply that we have within our existing urban growth boundary.
Yeah, exactly. And so, hopefully this middle housing, will help us get a little closer to those overall density targets. And so we talked about that, but, thinking about, again, not knowing the exact numbers of units, expecting them to be pretty low, especially at first, we are comfortable leaving the density targets where they are currently, and did not see, there's nothing in HB 2001, because they're used as targets rather than, regulations. We didn't see anything that needed to change at this time. Okay, and then the next piece of the code that we worked on were the dimensional standards. And you certainly heard that in the survey results, that generally people were not very interested in changing the setbacks or the height or the building envelope, the lot coverage. And so that just wasn't an area that we felt needed a lot of change at this time. The idea, just as Doug said, was that if you have a building envelope, which essentially is whatever's left on the lot once you do the setbacks and once you calculate the lot coverage, that whatever you want to put in it, right, with middle housing, go for it. You can put a single family home, you can put a duplex, but we're creating the opportunity for the same, amount of dwelling to be built. So we wanted to keep those pretty similar. A couple things to consider is, again, this is an iterative process, hopefully, for the city. So right now, the total lot coverage for R1 is about 60%. Maximum of that, 40% can be for a dwelling. And that's probably sufficient, if not particularly, it doesn't allow for a huge duplex, but that might be a good thing, just in terms of keeping that scale consistent. And so we're not recommending changes now, but certainly can be something to monitor depending on the kinds of building proposals you get in and if it's coming up as an obstacle to development. We are going to talk a little about height. Right now, it's allowed at 30 feet in most of these zones, the R1, R2, RP, and AR zone, just the R3 is higher. And so there is an opportunity to consider some changes to height there that would affect single family as well as duplexes, but we're not proposing any changes to the setbacks. Those are 12 to 15 feet in the front right now across all these zones, and 5 to 8 feet for the interior, which is the side and the rear. Okay, then you can tell by the small scale of text that digging into the duplex code for the master plans gets pretty complex, but we think that we have a pretty good handle on it. And we'll just walk through really quickly. The airport residential is the smallest of these areas. And we just were able to address that through some code changes to allow duplexes. Springbrook is probably the most complex of these, and it's also the most developable land. So we want to make sure that we get that right. And what we'll need to do there is we do need to get into the text of the plan itself in order to allow duplexes in the same places where single family detached dwellings are permitted. Northwest Newburgh and Springbrook Oaks are pretty similar. They have a code section that controls, and we need to, duplexes per se are easy to permit, but there are some density impacts from them that we need to revise the way that they're calculated in the code to make sure that the density there, separate from the overall targets we talked about just previously. There are specific density regulations in both those specific plan areas, and we need to make sure that duplexes are exempted so that they can be built on the same size lot. And then when we get into the riverfront, the use types are actually not a problem. Duplexes are already permitted there. And there are some design standards that apply to single family detached dwellings. And so the code change there is to apply the same standards to duplexes, which is allowed under HB 2001. If you're willing to do it to your single family detached dwellings, you can do it to duplexes. So that will just create a similar look. And then one of the bigger issues that we wanted your input on tonight is talking about duplex height. And so the height standards, as I mentioned, are 30 feet, which typically can accommodate 2 to 5 stories in most of these residential zones, and then 45 feet in R3. So not a concern there. But the question is for duplexes and all other development in these residential zones, of course, including single family detached dwellings, should we look at increasing the height limit to 35 feet, which allows for a full 3 stories? And so what we heard from Doug is that there have been some issues identified recently with the 30-foot limit, particularly on areas with slopes. You can imagine those are some of the undeveloped areas where there's a potential for new development. And another consideration is that, just foreshadowing here, spoiler alert, when we get to the triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses, the model codes suggests the height of 35 feet there. And so, we could just make things easier for ourselves and have the same height limit to accommodate all these dwelling types, equally. And we thought we'd give you a couple of visuals to try to break down what this might mean. So these are the visuals from the existing code to give you an idea of how height is measured. And the Newburgh code is pretty similar to most other codes. If you have a flat roof or what's called a mansard roof, I don't see those very often, but maybe you do. You just measure to the top, right? That seems easy enough. But if you have a pitched roof or a hipped roof, something with gables, in order to have a more, an easier way to measure the height that accommodates for, the extra height of the pointiness of the roof, to use a technical term, the height is measured to the midpoint of the pitched roof. And that also helps, it helps to avoid disincentivizing these more traditional roof forms, because if it was measured to the top, it would just make sense to always do a flat roof. Why would you waste your height allowance, putting in an angled, a pitched roof that just eats into your height allowance without adding any buildable area. So, there could technically be a structure right now that exceeds 30 feet because of the way that it's measured at its highest point, but the height as measured would meet the standard. Okay, and what we're looking at, another thing to point out is that, going up to 3 stories, often, but not always, that 3rd story can be used for a garage on the ground floor. So the picture on the bottom here is a sketch of a recently completed duplex, and you can see how they use that. Most of the 1st floor is technically used for the garage, and there's probably some, storage or something down there as well. But then there's 2 full living stories above. But picture on the right, you see, not everyone's doing it that way. So you could certainly wind up with, 3 full living spaces in that duplex example. And I apologize, some of these, it's actually really hard to find graphics explaining this difference. So this is, on the left, you see 1.5 stories compared to 2 stories on the left. And we're talking about, imagine a whole extra story underneath this. But you can kind of see the difference if you just focus on the top here. The one on the left, the reason I included is like that kind of gives you an idea what a quote unquote half story looks like, because it can be kind of, tricky to imagine. Like, it's, that movie, Being John Malkovich, where they have that like weird in between story and everybody has to bend over. It's not like that. It's more just about using some of the space under the pitched roof so that you have, you don't necessarily have the full story in terms of the floor plate. You have just sort of the inner area under the tallest part of the roof, compared to, say, on the right, where you've increased the height enough so that there is room for a full second story that has the same floor plate as the first story. Okay. And I apologize, this is a very bad quality graphic, but this is something that just helps illustrate how the bulk of 3 stories can look next to, a 2.5 story. This was produced as part of the Portland's residential infill project to help illustrate for them. They were working on how to measure height and trying to look at, if it made sense to allow for the full 3 stories or keep it at 2, regardless of the slope of the lot. But again, just gives you a comparative sense of the bulk there. So now we thought we'd all take a breath and give you a chance to share your questions, comments on the duplex provisions for the base zones, the master plan areas, and then your comments and a direction on the height limits as we just discussed. And I can go back to any of those graphics if it's helpful to answer that question.
If no one has any comments that they kind of jotted down during the presentation, Elizabeth, maybe we should go back and just kind of walk through those slides and see if people have any questions or comments on each one.
Sure. Anybody want to start? Just the basics of where we're going to allow them and the lot sizes and the density issue. I know this is kind of complex, but we put it in just to show we did the work. And the answer is really in this middle row here, that the minimum lot size for duplex will now be set at 5,000 square feet in R1 and AR, and 3,000 square feet in R2, R3, and RP.
So, Elizabeth, I might just chime in if I can.
Please do.
If that's okay. So for the committee members, kind of think about if you were in R1, what we're typically seeing is homes in the 2,000 to 2,400 square feet size. They are meeting our lot coverage requirements for the home and for the driveway. And so kind of imagine in your mind that if you had a duplex on that same lot, same 5,000 square foot lot, you're effectively going to have a duplex that is going to range on each unit from 1,000 square feet to 1,200 square feet, instead of having a 2,400 square foot home, if you're considering in this lot coverage piece. So again, we're not getting to the design piece, but just that's a way to kind of contextually think about what that building envelope might look like in the future. And of course, the designers get really creative of what they look like from the street, that curb appeal.
Okay. Anybody feeling brave and want to talk about the master plans? Okay, and then maybe any other thoughts about height? I think maybe we'll, just think about how these might look. Again, these particular examples sound, might not meet with the lot coverage standards that we're talking about in Newburgh. You can tell both of these are quite a lot larger than 1,000 square feet per unit. But I suppose that, adding a third story could allow more living area. So you might have something like 1,500 square feet per side of the duplex while still meeting the lot coverage standards.
Okay, I'm trying to understand all this. And the reason for a height maximum is, so I live in Oak Knoll in Newburgh, and I know that when somebody builds, we're all on a hill. So if somebody builds taller, you ruin the, so-and-so's view in the back, right? I mean, so I assume that's the pushback of why there's a height limit. Is that part of the reason?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And also, sort of a sense of, literally overshadowing people's backyards. So, right, height limits, it's just about controlling that building envelope and keeping it at a, quote unquote, traditional neighborhood scale.
But raising it gives the developer more options, maybe more affordable housing options.
It's interesting to think through whether it would be more affordable, or I got, in some ways, if you added an extra 500 square feet of living area, it could actually be less affordable, because it's more house. But, it could make a project pencil that wouldn't otherwise pencil, say. I don't know what the market is for 1,000 square foot, duplex units. Maybe they'd make good rentals. Maybe people would, want to buy them as a condo or something. I really can't speculate on that, but I think the idea is just that it would add more flexibility and make projects, at a variety of price points, more feasible, and keep them within that overall lot coverage that we talked about, that, that's within the code already.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for trying to work through all the ways these standards interact, because it is kind of tricky.
If
Okay.
developers were given the option with 35 feet to do either duplex or triplex, what's your prediction as to what they would come up with?
I'm not sure I could speculate, except to say that, I think that there's going to be a lot of hesitancy to try out new forms of development, right? And I would think that the market, quote unquote, for duplexes is potentially stronger than triplexes. Just duplexes are, even though we don't see that many of them, they're probably a little more proven. So, excuse me, I would expect more of those first.
Hey, Mom. Hey, Mom.
What is it?
I might just jump in while
Yeah,
Elizabeth
please
takes a quick
do.
question. Just thinking about this with our duplex goggles on, it raises a great point, Robert, about what happens when you get to triplex and quadplex, because in Newburgh, the code is written that the height limit is for that zone and not per building type. So when we do talk about the triplex and quadplex and wanting to provide flexibility, that 35 probably does make sense. And I agree with Elizabeth. I could not venture a guess at whether a duplex or triplex would be what would appear there. But I think, it's about providing the flexibility. And so the 35 would be more effective in providing that flexibility once you get into those other housing types, like you pointed out.
Well, see, part of my thought is if we could encourage triplex, that could possibly expand the amount of affordable housing.
Right. More units you have, the smaller units they are, the less they cost, but the land price stays the same.
Yeah.
Right. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that is also an interesting thing. I will say, first of all, the OARs, right, the minimum compliance don't only require that we have the same height limit for triplexes and quadplexes as we do for single family detached. We don't have to raise it to 35. But for all the issues that we've been talking about today in terms of development feasibility, the model code strongly recommends a height limit of 35 feet. So I guess I had sort of approached it as more like, well, if we're going to consider allowing that 35 feet for triplexes and quadplexes, let's just make it easy on ourselves and equal by allowing it for single family and duplexes. But I guess it's also interesting to think, you know, what if we had a different height limit, and would that incentivize the triplexes and quadplexes in a way that, you know, could bring more units and possibly more affordable units?
So Robert, this is Doug, is from one perspective, and it's not the right perspective, it's only one, is when you look at where our land base is and where new development can occur, which kind of then ties us into these master plans, is if you can kind of visually think about over off of Chehalem Drive, north of Highway 240, up to Columbia Drive, by and large, a little bit further north, that's relatively flat, right? And what we've got is a bunch of single family to the east. And then we've got on either side of Chehalem Drive, you know, a larger lot, 1 acre, 2 acre parcels that could be developed in the future, but it's relatively flat. Then if we go and we think about Springbrook Properties, which is in a master plan area, and you think of going from Mountain View north and you're going up the hill, you know, that's where a lot of our future residential development is going to occur. But you start to get into these topography issues. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, if you go up off of Terrace Drive and what's called the Terra Estates and Dutchman Ridge and King's Landing, we've got a lot of topography issues. And we have been challenged in part by getting those units that are there to meet our current height limitation.
Yeah.
And so some of those units you're seeing built is you've got a garage underneath and you've got a couple of floors. But what they've had to literally do to meet our height requirements is they've had to bring dirt in up against the concrete foundation walls. And they've modified the topography in order to meet the structure height.
Yeah.
Instead of having a decent flow for, you know, drainage coming down off of the hill, is it's kind of in a V between dwelling units to get captured into the storm draining system. So developers have had to be really creative. So for me, I start thinking about, oh, what about when we look at the Springbrook Master Plan, we start to move up that hill and up the drainage of Hess Creek on either side. You know, is 35 feet maybe a more appropriate? If we think about Springbrook Oaks as another area, again, that's largely developed, and our airport residential is largely developed. And then you go down to another level, so well, what about infill? You know, so we've got units that were built of 1-story ranch style homes. We've got 2-story homes that are at 30 feet. The ridge line is higher than 30, but halfway between the ridge and the peak. And if you went up that additional 5 feet, does it significantly change the visual character in that neighborhood? And those areas are relatively flat. Leslie mentioned she lives up in the Oak Knoll area, and in that area, you're going up the hill, but that area is also largely developed. There's some stuff down kind of to the south of Foothills. And then there's another piece of that master plan that's over towards the east, going towards Aspen Way, which has a lot of topography in it again. And so for me, I think about all of these things about how, you know, how these different height issues might fit into these different contexts of these areas where we've got infill or new developments going to occur in the future. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah. Well, see, I guess as I'm looking at it, if we allowed a 35-foot roof, as we do in some residential areas, one of my concerns is that we would see more of the higher end housing rather than the affordable housing that would want. That's just a concern.
Yeah, it is worth considering. I mean, I think that we can see it. I'll look and see if there was any work done on this at the state level about, you know, potential impacts on sizes and prices, and get back to you on that. I think that, you know, the difficulty in writing zoning code, right, is that we want to nudge people in the right direction,
Mhm.
but the zoning code isn't a great tool for that, you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, we maybe want to restrict something in the hopes that people pick this other option, and it might work, but if it doesn't work to develop those smaller duplexes for financial reasons, you know, we're not going to convince anybody just with the zoning code. We just might cut off any hopes for duplexes. And again, I'm not saying that that's what would happen with if we kept the 30-foot height limit. I really don't know. So I'll see if I can find any more financial details about that. So I know there was modeling done, particularly on triplexes,
Yeah.
that had to do with the total amount of building area. So that could be useful and relevant here. Another thing I'm thinking in talking, and I don't want to maybe get into this in detail now, but maybe something Doug and I could follow up on is thinking about maybe how we measure height in terms of if it's from average grade or if it's from highest grade or lowest grade on site. If the biggest issues seem to be moving up the slopes, maybe we could just look at how we set the grade from which height is measured and change some of the measurements and definitions to address those areas more specifically, that then could have, you know, more limited impacts on infill sites, for example, where the height limit wouldn't necessarily change, and maybe could, you know, be less affected.
And then also, if we look at it, 5 feet is not much difference between 30 and 35 feet.
Right. The 5 feet is not the difference, but the third story is the difference.
Okay.
Right. It only takes 5 more feet for most residential developers to get a full third story, which can be, you know, a big change in terms of visual impact from a 2-story development.
Yeah, Elizabeth brought up, you know, how we measure, and currently between our building code, Oregon Structural Specialty Code has a definition on calculating structure height, and what we use in our code is that same methodology.
Okay. Great. Okay, well, any more thoughts maybe on height limits before we move on? I'm hearing a lot of interest in, you know, really thinking through how it could impact housing. So that's what I think is exciting about zoning is, you know, not just the numbers we put down on paper, but how it impacts development on the ground. Okay, well, let's, you know, let that percolate and move on to design standards for other middle housing types. So what you had in your packet was the draft code for duplexes. And for, you know, I think as we explained in the memo, that code needs to be adopted in a separate package before June 30th of this year. So, you know, that will finalize based on some of this input and further discussion with Doug. We'll bring it back to you to confirm, but that's pretty well set. And so now we really get to, you know, the bigger piece of the code work is bringing in the other middle housing types. And we'll do that as a separate code package that goes on top of the duplexes, and will be adopted through a separate adoption process, you know, after June that the city will be leading. And I think the target date is fall, but, you know, none of us have to hold Doug to that. So when we start to get into all the other types of middle housing, right, our triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, there's 2 under the DLCD, you know, implementation. There are 2 major categories of code standards. There's the design standards and the siting standards. I think these names are a little bit of a misnomer, but the siting standards really have to do with, you know, the individual lots, the zones, a lot of the pieces we were just talking about for duplexes. And so we will work through the existing zones. And, you know, when we talk about like the lot sizes and the setbacks and the tables and all those, we'll just be adding in all these housing types within that, you know, within the existing code. based on the minimum compliance and the model code standards. But where we'll really be looking to add some new code sections to the Newburgh Code is looking at the design standards piece. And the design standards is less sort of, architectural design. Is it a craftsman? Is it, a modern ranch? Well, I don't know if modern ranches, I don't think that's a thing. Is it a ranch? Is it a, new, whatever it is they're building these days? It's less about that kind of architectural design or even the architectural details. Like, is there a bay window? There's a tiny bit of that, but for the most part, it's more about the design of how the building, how the dwellings relate to the site. So larger scale site design issues. And because there is, very specific language in the model code, and because for most of these dwelling types, they are new for the city of Newburgh, what we are proposing is, our initial proposal is to start with the full text of the design standards from the model code as, new sections for the Newburgh Code. And then what we're here to talk about and get your initial guidance on is, are there modifications to these design standards that you'd like us to see in the initial code draft that we're bringing back to you at our next meeting? So our, excuse me, our options for each of the standards from the model code for the design standards is we can either adopt, include it as is. It can be modified to be, quote, less restrictive. And this is pretty easy to determine for numerical standards. So say, a cottage cluster, you can require 150 square feet of open space per unit. So if you want it to be less restrictive, you could reduce it to 100 square feet per unit. Others are a little, it's not very clear what less restrictive would mean in some cases about things like entryway orientations. So, I think this modification sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And then the third option is to not include it. If it doesn't seem worth regulating, we don't have to include all of these design standards if it seems like overkill. But, we will say that from the, from following along with the model code and rulemaking process at DLCD, when they were doing it at the state level, the reason that our proposal is to adopt all of the design standards is because we think that they've done a pretty good job in honing in on the site design aspects that make the most impact on site development, and how these triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses and cottage clusters can fit into neighborhoods. So I don't, we're not necessarily going to recommend this final option, having no design standard, but we just want to say, it's certainly out there if you think anything is too regulatory. Okay, so we'll start first. Our goal is really just to walk through these tonight, get your initial feedback, and then we'll use them to shape that draft code. So you'll get another chance. But the triplex and quadplexes, we're going to be looking at the entry orientation, a minimum window coverage, garage and off-street parking areas. We certainly heard in the survey how important that is. So, we'll talk about what the ability is through the model code to regulate those, and related is the driveway approach piece. Okay, so these diagrams that I pasted in here are from the model code. And these address the entryway orientation. And so what the entry orientation standards say is basically you have three choices. Your main entrance can face the street and be less than 8 feet setback from the main facade of the dwelling. That sort of helps these new dwellings pass what I call the trick or treat test. Can you find the front door in order to knock on it, in order for your kids to knock on it to get candy on Halloween, right? And if it's set too far back or, tucked around the back, it can be, I say, well, that house does not pass the trick or treat test. So they think that, if you don't set your door back by more than 8 feet, you'll pass. The other option here is to have your main entrance open onto a porch. And then the entrance itself doesn't have to face the street as long as the porch is facing the street. And then this final option on the right is if you think about our plexes option or the detached plex option, right, where you might have 3 or 4 detached units, and you want a little bit more of a common clustered orientation, then the entrances could face onto a common open space that's then connected to the sidewalk with the pedestrian path. So those are the 3 options that are in the model code. We think these are totally reasonable in terms of, bringing these dwellings and having them create a relationship with the street. And any thoughts here? Or maybe do you want me to just walk through all of them, or comments as we go along? No,
I like pausing for comments as we go along.
Yes, because we have the visuals up right now.
That said, if there are no comments,
we can always come back. We'll maybe take a little pause for each of these as we go through, and then have a final discussion break at the end. Okay. The next piece is window coverage for triplexes and quadplexes. So my biggest beef with this particular diagram is that the total window coverage that they're showing, it appears to me to greatly exceed 15%. So I think it's a little bit misleading, but the point is that all of the street facing facade, you define that facade area, and of that up to 15%, you can set the minimum for window and entrance door coverage requirement. So again, I think this is pretty reasonable. 15% for residential uses, it's not very common to exceed that because of privacy concerns. Things like, what if you have a bathroom on that wall? You don't want a picture window necessarily. So I think this is pretty reasonable. Just for comparison, we don't apply any minimum window coverage to single family or duplexes, and we see generally sufficient window coverage for those. So I think this should be relatively easy to meet. Any questions? But still serves an important public purpose, right? Of making that visual and physical connection to the street, adding some eyes on the street, and just neighborliness.
Is a 15% a maximum or a minimum?
It's a maximum minimum, right? So the city standard can be a minimum of 15% window coverage, but the city can't set a higher number. The city can't require 20%, for example.
Okay.
You can go down to 10%, say, or 11%, but.
I was going to say Gabriel in a prior meeting was talking just about that light and visibility and so forth getting into the units. And so this kind of plays, Gabriel, to your comment from a couple meetings ago.
Yes, and the other thing what I was thinking, when you have the attic style, the top floor, you can always use sunroofs. Is it?
Yeah.
Skylights or whatever you call them. So yes, that's the how to get enough daylight in.
Okay, and then we get to the width of garages and parking areas. And so this definitely ties into, the concerns about, does parking dominate the site? And it's a fine line of, we've heard this desire to make sure that all of these units have parking. And again, spoiler alert, we'll probably be drafting the code to have 1 parking space per unit be required for these types, which is the most that can be required under the state regs. But if you are going to require that parking, it needs somewhere to go, but still without, dominating that front facade. When you get into, say that window coverage, you still want to have opportunities for windows facing the street. You still want to have the entrances facing the street. And so to balance that, the model code standard is that the combined width of all the garages and driveways on the site, and so that's represented by these, A1, A2, and A3 here, can't total more than 50% of the front facade of the total street frontage, right? The width, or the lot width is the other way to say that, on the property line. So that's the balance that they've come up with. So I think here, let's see, if you wanted to be less restrictive, you could allow for more driveway and garage coverage, but not less. And the idea is, that 50% balances, literally, half balances the feasibility of providing these parking areas against, requiring as much of the unit itself and the entrances to be up near the front of the property. And I would say, I think that, fitting these driveways in is going to be one of the key challenges for sites. So I think this, could be a really important driver of site design. Okay, and it is related to how wide the driveways can be at the street, right? So in many cases, like in this diagram, the width of the driveway on the property and the width of the driveway opening are going to be the same. But sometimes you do see, a narrower width at the street, and then it flares out to be, say, a double wide driveway on the site. So this standard is particularly concerned with the width of the driveways at the street and works in concert with the previous standard. And what this says is you cannot exceed 32 feet combined of driveway access onto the local street per triplex or quadplex. So, 32 feet per frontage could be, I don't know if you'd actually get, I don't know if you could fit 4 driveways with that, or more like, 2 16-foot wide shared driveways, but that is the recommended standard. I do have some questions here, and I don't know if Doug, you want to chime in now, or if we'll keep working on it, about whether Public Works would allow this to happen, to have 4 separate driveways from one lot accessing the street. A lot of city codes don't permit that. So I think here's where we're going to need to think about whether shared driveways, need to be either mandated or, heavily encouraged by limiting some of the other options. But this is what the standard is initially promoting.
Yeah, what this gets into from the engineering department perspective is, if you're on a local residential street, could you do something like this? Yes. Then what we get into is other provisions, is where does the mailbox go? Where do the street trees go? Where do the street lights go? So there's this whole body of other standards that run into a direct conflict about the width of the driveways and the spacing of the driveways, for this example, in a quadplex. And so that's definitely something we're going to have to talk with our engineering department about. Now, if you were on a minor collector street, again, might this be feasible? Yes. Same issues apply that I just brought up. On a major collector, you would not be able to have a driveway onto the major collector roadway. So then these units would get rotated basically 180 degrees. You have to take the access off of a local street. And so your backyards would be facing to the local, in this diagram, to the local street. And then you'd have another local street on the other side. So yeah, there's a lot of complexity given engineering standards and what might have to be adjusted or modified to allow this.
Yeah, this is probably the area that I have the most questions about. That I understand why the state is trying to regulate it, but I'm not going to say that they overreached. I just think that there still needs to be that engineering discussion locally.
Yeah, because in our current code, we typically look at it as a driveway is 9 feet wide. And in this context, it's 8. And so that's something else we're going to have to look at, because we have standards for garage widths. If you're got a single car garage, or if you've got a double car garage. And so we're going to have to look at those provisions, and do they also need to be modified? As you can get to a point, you may have a single car garage, and so addressing the issue about parking, but when you pull into the garage, can you open your door to get out of your car? I could say a garage like this will not fit a four-wheel drive pickup. It might fit a Prius or a Yugo or
Mini Coopers for everyone.
mini Coopers and so forth. So that's something we're going to have to take a look at.
Yeah, agreed. We definitely would point to the need for some alignment with the engineering standards. But, just to give you an idea of the issues that we'll be working with. Okay, and yeah, to Doug's point, there are some other alternatives here for triplexes and quadplexes. If there is an alley, for example, then access can come off of the alley instead of from the local street. And let's see, and if you have multiple local streets, and you have a corner lot, then, I think that really frees up some of your options, because you could split your accesses up to the two different frontages.
So I have a question. Were we looking at duplexes with that possible third story having the under parking, and they're the sort of 50% or less was not in play, right? Like, so why would it be different?
Sure. So the reason that it's different is because, there's different ways to answer the question. My first answer is because Newburgh doesn't regulate how wide garages can be for single family detached homes, it can't regulate how wide they can be for duplexes. The idea is that those two types are supposed to be regulated the same. So, perhaps this prompts the question that maybe you would like to add, or at least look at some regulations for single family homes and duplexes about how wide garages could be as part of the facade. But that's why, we were constrained there. But as we get into these other housing types, DLCD and the rulemaking committee recognized that there are different design challenges that come with these plexes. And so the design standards that are in the model code are really additional tools that they're giving to the cities and saying, hey, you can add these additional standards. You don't have to apply these to your single family homes, but you can apply these to your plexes, because we realize there's going to be more challenges, so that you have, a way to try to address the compatibility issues.
Yeah, so in our code, it's kind of a quirky thing, and maybe we can fix it through this process to some degree. You actually go to our definition section, and it says that a double car garage has to be 20 feet by 20 feet, and that's interior wall to interior wall. For a single car garage, it has to be 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, again, from interior wall to interior wall. And it was an odd thing when I first got here, and I looked at that, and because people have missed it, and we actually, there's a question about if we have some garages for single car developments in either single family or duplexes, if they meet those standards or not. So we'll have to make a note of that, Elizabeth, that we'll have to pay attention.
Yeah, no, that is a very good, fine reading of the code. I don't think that we caught that. So is your point to say, Doug, that those maximum widths, the 10 feet or the 20 feet for a double car garage, that's all that would be permitted for a single family or duplex?
Yeah, so, if we were looking at these drawings, and just, let's take the one that's on the right-hand side, there's a duplex. It would say that garage for each unit in that duplex, that it would have to be 10 feet wide from interior wall to interior wall and 20 feet in depth, basically garage door to interior wall of the house. Same provision applies to detached single family. So
Right.
the way the code's written is, if you build a garage, it has to be these dimensions.
Gotcha. And so, sort of the assumption that if you're limited to 20 feet, then you'll probably have at least as much, building facade.
Hopefully.
Right.
Hopefully. Because that gets to, part of this is, do you want your facade to be dominated by garages, or do
Right.
you
The
want
snout house.
the snout house? And I live in a snout house.
There's real advantages, but
yeah, there really is. Or do you want the way our code for single family is currently structured is, it's 20 feet to the garage space, and that would allow a full length parking space in front of the garage, and then 15 feet to the house. So you get the house articulating towards the street to give you that articulation. So when we get to these triplexes and quads, it's a design issue about what you're looking for. Do you want just a row of garage spaces?
yes.
And then you may have some living space on the ground floor behind, and then you've got floors above. Or do you want some of that living space to come out towards the street and kind of then tucking your garage or your parking further back underneath the building footprint?
Right. And to just complicate it a tiny bit further, what the model code is saying with these design standards in terms of what's more or less restrictive is, they've certainly heard both sides of that argument. And so there's a feasibility point to allowing that parking on the front. And so they're trying to make a guaranteed, allowance for a certain amount of parking on front facades that can be just, easy peasy accessed from the local streets. But capping that, and that if you need more, then you have to make an alternative site design. But some cities, for example, only allow this alley access example shown on the left here. And it's, cost prohibitive for many developments to build both a local street and an alley. So what the model code is saying is, guys, you can't force all these plexes to completely hide their parking. You can't force them to go to all alley access. There has to be some provision to balance those front facades and allow access from the local street to improve that feasibility and get those parking spaces that everyone said they wanted.
Yeah, because there's one school of thought is when you take the drawing on the left and you have the alley, and then you look at standards and you got fire access standards, you got garbage is going to have to be picked up and so forth. And all of a sudden you got an alley that's 20 or 25 feet wide. And one school of thought is, well, why would you do that? You're paving over more. You got more impervious surface area. You now have bigger water quality facilities you got to deal with. You got more infrastructure that you're going to have to deal with, because now you got stormwater in pipes. And then are those alleys public or are they private? If they're public, then how do they get maintained? If it's public side, then we've got to maintain those. If they're private alleys, which we don't currently allow, then you'd have to change the regulations. And then you're getting into the issue about having homeowners associations who have to maintain the private alleys. But then people live there and they call the city anyway and say, well, no, this alley's back here. You got to come maintain it. And we go, no, it's privately owned. Your HOA has to maintain that. And so when you start to go down the cascade, and I apologize if I'm starting to do that, you just get into all of these questions. So model codes are good to a point, but then there's lots of nuances that come in with them.
Right. But I mean, I guess the point being that there could be alley access, but the model code is definitely taking a stand that cities cannot require only alley access as an option for these sites because of this whole cascade of impacts. So, it's an option if you want to do alleys, but it can't be the only way to develop these sites because of all those issues.
Because we also have to take in, we got vision clearance triangle requirements at street intersections that we're going to have to take into consideration. The code currently has some driveway separation distance, which is part of our engineering side. So we're going to have to talk to them about that. And do we need to make some modifications for triplexes and quads?
Right. And I guess the last piece I'll make before we move on is just also when we think about the spacing of these driveways and we talk about parking, right? First, we do want to get this off-street parking that we're going to require. But the more driveways you put, and if they're too close to each other, you completely eliminate any on-street parking. So it's really a net zero gain of parking spaces, if you do it wrong. So we will want to take a look at that and see if we can, look at ways to maximize both retaining enough on-street parking while getting this off-street parking. Okay, all right. So, gosh, I feel like we've definitely talked about some of these issues already, but one more discussion point on plexes before we move on. Okay, let's get into townhouses, which are actually pretty similar. So you guys can start to feel like experts. So again, we've got, if you think about, as we saw in that visual tour, a lot of townhouses look pretty similar to, side-by-side attached triplex and quadplex units. So very similar design issues. The entry orientation, same standards. You can either bring your entrance up to this, up within 8 feet of the street-facing facade, or open onto a porch. And then the next piece, this is where I said, like, oh, you get a little bit of an opportunity to regulate bay windows and things like that, is that there is an option to require one unit defining feature per townhouse, and they've listed them out, A through G: roof dormers, balconies, bay windows, facade offsets, etc. And so we'll essentially add this menu approach, and then each unit can have one. You see in the diagram, several of the units have more than one. So certainly that would be permitted, but you can only require a minimum of one. And then we've got the same window coverage, same drawing, in fact, about 15% for the townhouses. And then we get into very similar parking issues. And the difference here is just that because they're on individual lots, sometimes the engineering standards are different, because a lot of times each lot is guaranteed one access. So the way that the model code approaches townhouses, similarly, some cities have said, I've certainly been in cities where if you have, or worked in cities, I guess back in the day, I used to actually travel to cities, but as well, there's certainly cities codes where they say, if your lots are below, say, 30 feet wide, you have to have alley access. And that triggers that whole cascade of impacts and costs that we just talked about. And so what the model code is saying is, they want to guarantee an option for street access to driveways and parking. And what they're saying for townhouses, to maximize feasibility, is that any lot that's at least 15 feet wide, which is probably going to be most of the lots, there has to be a guaranteed allowance of up to 12 feet of driveway and garage width. And so I guess it'll be interesting, I guess maybe that's going to be 10 feet here in Newburgh, if 10 feet is how wide a single car garage can be. But basically any lot that is at least 15 feet has to be allowed to have that driveway, which, as you can see in this diagram, doesn't, it isn't necessarily going to hit that 50-50 balance of having some front facade that's the building and the living area, and some that is the driveway and the garage. The garages really could start to dominate some of the front facades here. But I guess that's the trade-off that is in the model code. So there are, of course, a few other options. If you're on a corner lot, these ones on the right here, there are some options for shared access or a consolidated access way. But these ones can only be required if the lots are less than 15 feet, which, I don't know that we're recommending any lots reducing the minimum lot width below that. So I think these ones on the right would just be an option. Okay, so thinking through there, any questions, comments about these, either modifying or limiting any of these standards for townhouses? Okay, well,
I think everybody's overwhelmed, Elizabeth.
it is so much. So again, this is your preview. So, anything you want to say now helps. And even if it's just a question of, wow, that looks great, or that sounds terrible, or how is this going to work? Any of those are welcome right now. But also just to give you a preview of what we're thinking as we're interpreting this. So Last one to go through with you is talking about the cottage clusters. And these are, the challenging one, just they're always the last in the series. And I think, frankly, even the model code, you can sort of tell that like people got tired by the time they got to cottage clusters. And it's the most unlike the other housing types. So as you can see just from this list, there are the most options for design standards here. And I do think that, most of these pieces are going to be important to make a cottage cluster work. But I would just also, as an overall caution, remind the group that, cities that have had cottage cluster standards in the past have generally overregulated. That has led to the production of 0 to few cottages. So I think the model code has done an admirable job on cutting back, but there could still be some opportunities to be selective about some of these pieces. So the ones, as you see, there's a longer list, but the 3 that I pulled out that I think that are going to impact site development feasibility the very most are, first of all, this requirement for cottage orientation, that 50%, or here's where your less restrictive option comes in. You can require a minimum of 50% of the units to be oriented towards the common open space. Which certainly creates that cluster, but as we'll see in some examples here, can, have some restraints on how the site gets developed and maybe make it less feasible. The other piece is the common courtyard design standards. And again, that is really the heart of a cottage cluster, is having this common courtyard. And so the standard is 150 square feet of open space per unit. I think that's that number is a pretty good compromise. You could reduce it further, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting there. Existing codes, that are in play go up to 400 square feet per unit. So, or 200 is pretty common. So I think that bringing it to 150 in the model code is really an attempt to keep this common courtyard, but prevent it from dominating the site. Even though 150 square feet per unit doesn't sound like a whole lot, the actual standards of how that common courtyard has to be designed means that it can't include any of the perimeter setbacks that are still required. And it has to be, really a contiguous, more or less, well, it doesn't have to be a square, but it does have to be one contiguous piece that is not less than 15 feet at any one point. So, it's really looking for a good chunk of land. And if you've ever seen subdivision or PUD approvals, you'll know that developers can often find these like weird, bizarre, skinny triangles of land, or, branching semicolons of land, and, declare those as common open spaces when they're not really very useful. So the goal with the common courtyard standards is quality over quantity, to make it, maybe not an onerous number, but an actual good centralized chunk of land. Then the last piece is the parking design. And so the model code started, as the conversation went, it started by requiring parking in some shared parking pods, separate from the individual cottages, and they have relaxed it a little bit to envision more what it would look like with garages for each cottage. And we'll just get into, exactly how feasible those might be. So first piece of those that I highlighted, right? So is that the cottage orientation with a minimum of 50% of the units facing the courtyard. So this is the code diagram, and you can see in this particular example, I'd say almost all of the units, maybe not the one on the very, upper right, but all the others face onto the common courtyard. So, this example certainly meets that, creates that cluster effect. And this one exceeds the standard. You have to have cottages bounding at least 2 sides of the common courtyard. And so this one is enclosed on 3 sides. So you're exceeding. And the common courtyard, again, like we talked about, it's really meant to be a nice, big, centralized chunk and not just, a scattered remnant throughout the site. So that's sort of how these pieces come together. And then to talk about the parking, right? So the piece on the left, right, this shared parking area with individual parking spaces. In this case, they're surface parking spaces, but it could be, you know, like a carport structure or a shared garage here instead. The model code has what I think are fairly restrictive standards on how these have to be arranged. That could really eat up an awful lot of site area and decrease feasibility and really cut into the density that could be achieved otherwise with these cottages. So, you know, first of all, you can only have 5 spaces before you have to have this landscaping buffer, which is pretty restrictive. A lot of codes for other types of parking lots allow at least 10 or 12 spaces before you need a landscape buffer. It has to be set back 20 feet from the street. It has to be screened with some landscaping. It has to be set back 10 feet from any side property line. And, you know, all those pieces are great in terms of reducing the visual impact of these parking areas within a neighborhood. But, you know, I don't think this diagram is to scale, but, you know, when you just start thinking about how much land area is getting eaten up by leaving buffers and boundaries and areas around these shared parking areas, you know, I really have to question how feasible it's going to be to lay to site these. And so that, you know, I'm not the first person to mention this. They definitely got this commentary during the rulemaking process. And so, I'm sorry, sweetheart.
I can tell you something.
I really have to talk later, okay?
They were dancing at the Secret Museum, people.
Okay, bye. Dancing at the Secret Museum. Sorry, excuse the interruption. So what DLCD did in the model code is they added on more explicitly these carport and garage options that you see on the right of this diagram, with the option for these driveways to serve and access them. And I don't think this diagram is meant to, you know, like fully represent how this would look if you added it, you know, throughout the site. Maybe this driveway would extend and loop through the site to access more of the cottages. But in adding these carport and garage options, perhaps they read the Newburgh code, because the maximum width for any individual garage is 20 feet. And then they've also said that the garages and carports can't abut the common courtyard. They have to be sort of on the back side so that you're not interrupting, you know, the cluster feature. Okay.
Mom, the phone's not working. It's not on its side.
All right. There we go. Excuse me, technical difficulties. Okay, and so you've probably seen these diagrams before. We had these in our past couple of meetings, and these were presented by a developer from Hayden Homes who works, you know, throughout the metro area, possibly, you know, the whole Willamette Valley of cottage type developments, you know, and the challenge to DLCD and the rulemaking committee was, hey, these projects actually worked. They penciled, but how they wouldn't work under the code. So I bring them back for us to discuss in terms of how, you know, how and whether you want to make the cottage cluster design standards a little bit more, you know, add any flexibility to make, you know, if not this exact, but something similar type of development permissible.
Mom, it's, can I get it on Molly?
Okay, you do it. I can't talk now.
No, but I can't.
So, and I think
Yeah,
Steve and I
you
could
said
jump in. Yeah. We did actually present this exact slide at the previous, when we were first introducing these housing types and talked about this. This has been on Elizabeth's radar in particular, as she's been thinking through how cottage clusters, you know, a lot of attention was given in the model code to the courtyard, of course, but you know, what if you don't need it all to be right around a courtyard? So in that case, you might want to consider reducing the requirements of how many sides of the courtyard need to have the cottages, what percentage need to be facing the courtyard, and that size of the courtyard, because here you really have a kind of a smaller courtyard toward the bottom, and then maybe you have like your pathway through the area on the top right. So you really have like a couple areas here instead of one complete courtyard. So, and then here parking also is a lot closer, and we definitely have heard Gosh, it's hard to get your groceries to your home when your parking area is like all in the bottom right corner and you live in the top left corner. So having parking dispersed throughout the site can be really helpful to residents as well.
Great, good coverage, Heather. Thanks for that pitch hitting. Okay, and here's another development that was presented that is cottage cluster like. And what the benefit of this is that it appears to meet the garage standards. They use these, alleys / driveways in order to provide these garages on the back of each of the units. But it may not meet the courtyard orientation standards. You see tract B in the center. All of those units, meet the standards in the sense that they're, two sides of the courtyard are enclosed by the dwellings. But if you count up the total number of those units compared to the total units throughout the rest of the site, I don't believe that it totals 50%. And then the tract C on the top and the tract A on the bottom, those are both would not be considered common courtyards. And because they're in the setback area, and because those dwellings only enclose those tracts on one side, they wouldn't meet the definition for a courtyard. So, I think there's, pluses and minuses to this particular or site plan, but just to say that, the cottage courtyard, the cottage design standards wouldn't permit this. There may be a case for looking at more flexibility, or there may be a case for saying, yeah, this really isn't what we mean. And yeah, it's good that the standards would require some changes to this site plan, because this isn't what we want to see. So we'll just turn it over for anybody that isn't completely exhausted thinking about code, for any more thoughts about cottage orientation, the common courtyard design, parking design, or if you have any questions on these other pieces, I'm happy to talk about them. But I think that they are, less important in terms of feasibility.
I kind of feel like if what you're saying is these cottage clusters, that the courtyard is the point, for people to be facing into those or have easy access to that, that those last two examples, I think they just make things confusing. And I mean, I'm all for flexibility, but like, why try to fit them into the box that they're not? Maybe call them something else. Like they want more density, yet freestanding buildings. But it's not it doesn't seem like a cluster to me. And yeah, I think for people that aren't going through this kind of process, it's going to be even more confusing. But maybe it doesn't matter. It's just the developers that need to understand it.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think you raise a good point. Like, what are we trying to accomplish with these cottage courtyards or cottage clusters? If it's really just a small lot subdivision, that's not necessarily a cluster. I think that the other way to think about it is, HB 2001 creates this opportunity for cottages, and I think it's up to, the model code helps to set the direction, and Newburgh gets to decide what's right for them. Like, is the common courtyard the heart of this dwelling type or not? Does it have to be, as prominent as it is in some of these diagrams, or could there be, a reduced focus on the courtyard and is there still a valid cottage-like, housing objective that can be achieved? Whether it looks exactly like some of those site plans or not is for us to discuss.
I have a question, Elizabeth, about the sidewalk width. So it indicated 4 feet. But if you've got a number of units all on one lot, it raises the question, do you have ADA accessibility requirements, which pushes it, you need to have 5 feet?
I think that is a fascinating question, Doug, and a very good read. A fun fact, the initial draft of the code did require a 5-foot minimum width for those pedestrian pathways for exactly that reason. And then the final version reduced it to 4 feet, but still says that they have to be accessible. And I asked DLCD, for all of their like fine-tune work, they also kind of missed some things of like defining like what does accessible mean. So I asked, does this mean ADA accessible? And they said yes. And I'm not quite sure how to reconcile the two things, that they're supposed to be accessible paths to meet ADA standards, but can only be 4 feet. We can only require a 4-foot minimum width. That doesn't add up to me. So I think it's worth a follow-up question.
I think so, because I don't think any community around the state wants to put in 4 feet and then all of a sudden somebody files a complaint with the Department of Justice and says, you're not accessible. Now you got to tear them all out and put in 5 foot.
Right. I mean, it could be one of those cases where the zoning code standard is 4 feet, but the actual standard is 5 because you still have to meet ADA. But why would we create that confusion?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the provisions may be a little different if each unit in a cluster was on its own lot. There's some distinction in there.
Yeah. Okay, well, if I've talked you all to death with cottage clusters.
I would, just another observation, and we didn't get to talk about this the other day, is, in the clusters, no more than 5 spaces without a landscape island. Our current code, if you were doing a multifamily development, is no more than 7 spaces before you need to have a landscape island. Then again, and of course, those are different provisions. And then of course, we have X number of square feet of landscaping in a parking lot that you have to meet. And these cottage clusters don't really get to that provision. And maybe that's okay.
Right. And, if the 7 spaces before a landscape island is the locally preferred option, that would be less restrictive than every 5 spaces. So, we certainly could calibrate it. A good point that there isn't an overall, square footage per parking space, but with those setbacks, of 20 feet from the street and 10 feet from any property line, you're going to get a fair bit of landscaping around these parking areas.
And then it leads me to, I always have lots of questions. Steve laughs at me. Doug's always got a question. So in the cottage clusters, where do you put your trash? There's no trash enclosure. What about lighting of the parking lot? And then, we have provisions in other sections of our code is that, you can have no more than 0.5 foot candles at the property line. So if you had a cottage cluster in an area that had theoretically detached single family homes, do you want this parking lot with all of a sudden, 12-foot parking lot lights that are LED and it looks like this little globe that's sitting there? That's something else I think the committee would want to. So parking, lighting, trash, how do you deal with all of those? And some of those even go back to the triplex and the quads as well, is where do you, depending on how it's designed, is what do you do with the trash? If you do have a parking field behind it, do you have to light it?
Right. Do you have to screen the trash, or can you just leave it on the, in the front yard?
And then we'll have to talk with our engineering department, because we've got all these stormwater requirements, and none of the tri-quads clusters address issues about stormwater. And where do you put those? And so like for a cottage cluster, yeah, you may have the courtyard in the center, but all of a sudden does that courtyard become a water quality facility, which becomes unusable? And so those kinds of things, I'm not sure that at the state level they thought through all of that. Maybe they did. I didn't attend all the meetings.
Yeah, I didn't attend them all either, but I would certainly say that it was zoning focused, right? As opposed to engineering focused, to their credit, that makes, right? That's where planners are going to start. But you know, that issue of water quality features. And, you know, I don't think that they didn't preempt local government's right to require stormwater management, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of thought, you know, clearly given to where do you put the stormwater facilities on these lots.
Then another observation we're going to have to take into consideration is fire access. And so when you deal with these cottage clusters and you build a parking lot and you have units X number of feet away, TVF&R might look at that and say, well, we don't have access to get to those northern units as they lay the hose.
Yeah.
Situation. And then they have provisions about if your parking lot is over a certain length in depth from a street, all of a sudden now you need a fire lane turnaround so they can turn around their apparatus, which then takes up more land.
Yes, right. And we certainly don't want the fire access standards to go away. We want there to be safety in these new developments, but, you know, I don't, you know, it's also interesting, you know, if we go back to our X-Men metaphor, right? Like the fire department gets to be, you know, Storm or whatever they want to be. And they get to have their own standards that apply in addition to the zoning standards, to the extent that we can anticipate and achieve, you know, consistency between them is preferred, of course. We don't want to set up any conflicts, but I don't know that we have to, you know, predict and incorporate every aspect of the fire here in our code. We can let the fire people do their work.
I think if I could add to that too, Elizabeth, it was going through my mind that, you know, if you were building a subdivision of single family homes, you'd still have these standards that you have to meet. So it's fair to apply those standards, right? Because they're single family development standards. If the fire access is 150 feet for hose, then it's 150 feet for hose, and that still applies. The one that Doug has me going, that's a great one, is the water quality facility in the courtyard. I've seen this in a park recently in another jurisdiction where the park was drawn out but not detailed, and then the water quality facility ended up in the park and nobody's happy. And so let's think about how we can be creative there, you and I, when we come about our next round, or maybe ask that question, like what are other jurisdictions doing? Because that is a big one, I think, that we need to think through.
Yeah, no, there are some specific standards in the model code about like what counts as the common courtyard or not, but I don't think that it talks about water quality. So we can look at it. My like best worst story about water quality features and subdivision design was I had a developer try to tell me once that their water quality feature would be used for model boat racing, and there would be like a league of model boat racers that were going to, you know, form in the new community, and therefore we should count the full area of the stormwater pond as recreation area. Never mind that it also has to be fenced and locked for liability reasons, but somehow they were going to get in with their boats, you know. All right, well, so we certainly have our work cut out for us in pulling together these various threads and, you know, putting together the design standards, not to mention those siting standards that we talked about. But we are looking at an exciting series of upcoming meetings. Steve, did you want to talk about this, or do you want me to?
Sure, I'm happy to. You could probably use a break. And thanks, everybody. That's a lot of material, we know. And, you know, we're doing our best to break it into chunks for you. And I think our team's doing a good job of that. But it's hard to get around the fact that there's just a lot of details for us to get into. So Doug sent you an email proposing that we move our next advisory committee meeting from February 3rd to February 17th. Doug, did you get responses on that request?
I received 4 responses back that the 17th works. So in that case, we have a majority that can make the 17th.
Great. Well, obviously, especially considering the issues raised towards the end of today's meeting, you know, not only do we need to look at other middle housing, but also that hopefully that gives us time to answer some of these great questions that have been raised throughout the meeting. So we'll look forward to meeting with you on February 17th from 6 to 8 p.m. I would assume, Doug, there will be some sort of calendar invite heading their way soon.
There will be an email for them to put a hold. Yes.
Okay, perfect. And then following closely on the heels of that meeting, we will have another virtual public open house on February 23rd. We're going to have to think long and hard about, how we take this dense material that we presented to you and really break it down for the public that doesn't, hasn't spent the time thinking about these matters, and as we discussed earlier, still probably doesn't completely understand what we're talking about here. So we'll do our best to think that through. Associated with that meeting, we'll have another online survey, another opportunity for people to learn and share their thoughts, good, bad, or otherwise. And then this group will come back again to meet one more time on, I don't know if it's the last time, but again, I should say on March 10th, I think it's the last time, to go over our final code proposals. So basically, between your next meeting and March 10th, we'll take all the comments that we get from you and from the public, and we will refine our code proposals and then move into the adoption process for the duplex code in particular. But as of March 10th, that'll be your last official meeting as the advisory committee for this process. Doug, anything to add?
No, that gets us through March 10th. Just so the committee member is aware, we'll be doing a joint work session with the Planning Commission and the City Council on March 15th and getting feedback from them. So by the time we get to March 10th, at least for sure on the duplexes, we're going to be looking for a recommendation from this committee to forward on to the Planning Commission and the City Council. And we'll probably ask for a tentative recommendation on the other middle housing, because that, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, that will actually come back to Council and Planning Commission in the fall of 2021.
Great. Any final questions from any of our committee members? Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
Well, before we get done, I have one circle back we have to do.
Sure.
Approval of the minutes.
Ah.
So, Madam Chair, if you could ask for approval for a motion to approve the minutes, and then we would need a second.
I thought we only had 4 of us here.
There's only, let's see.
Is there 9 of?
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's only 7 of you now because Jay Montoya resigned from the committee. So yes, you do have a quorum to do the minutes.
Okay. So should I do each individual? It's November 4th and November 18th, or at the same time?
You can do them all at the same time.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from November 4th and November 18th?
I motion to approve those minutes.
Is there a second?
Robert,
Second.
yeah.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and the minutes, I guess that would be, do we all vote then? All approve?
All you have to say, all those who say aye.
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 All those
right.
opposed? Done. Okay.
And Doug, Heather just pointed out to me, we did have one member of the public in the meeting for a little bit, but they since left. Just wanted to note that.
Okay.
Do you need that person's name?
I think I got it. I think it was Daniel Danisic.
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 D-A-N-I-C-I-C.
Yes, I did get that. Thank you.
Do we,
And
yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
so, yeah, so it's 7:59. I guess we'll end the meeting.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
If you have any comments between now and our February 17th meeting, please forward them on to me. Send me an email and I will get that forward on to the consultant team. So as we go through this, they can take that into consideration.
Okay,
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you.
sounds
Good
good.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.